So the final item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 5219 in the name of Dave Thompson on prohibit cold calling for property maintenance and repairs. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would ask members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. Mr Thompson, if you are ready, if you would like to open the debate, please, 7 minutes.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. And I also thank members from across the Chamber for supporting this motion and thereby enabling tonight's debate. I also particularly thank those of you who are here to speak on this important subject this evening. Before I go any further, I must also declare an interest, as I am a Vice President of the UK's Trading Standards Institute and a past Director of Trading Standards and Protective Services. The issue of cold calling for property maintenance and repairs causes a huge amount of stress for Scottish consumers, and I have come across many such cases over the years. Last year, between April and November, the Citizens Advice Helpline dealt with 421 cases of such cold calling, concerning nearly £700,000 worth of consumer expenditure. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. An iceberg which the Scottish branch of the Trading Standards Institute has labelled, and I quote, one of the most disturbing and socially significant issues that is faced by trading standards officers today. Due to the nature of property maintenance work, it is particularly important to ensure that consumers are not being misled, taken advantage of or tricked into agreeing to unnecessary work. Whilst the purchase of many other items or services from cold callers is protected by legislation, which creates a cooling-off period, which means you are able to change your mind, this is not the case for property maintenance and repairs. So you will be protected by a cooling-off period if you buy double glazing or insurance from a cold caller, but not if you agree to a property maintenance or repair job, like fixing your roof or tarring your drive. The added problem is that many property maintenance and repair jobs are not easily reversible. If a trader resurfaces a driveway or harrows a wall, it cannot simply be undone. For this reason, it is critical that consumers are afforded the time to make an informed decision on such jobs. Direct marketing through online adverts, emails and phone calls is fairly easy to deal with. Consumers are protected from intimidation and are also offered a reasonable period of time between contact being made and the work starting. However, having someone appear at your door, often ready to start the work immediately, can be very intimidating. And it is worrying to note that many cold callers target vulnerable groups, particularly older people, who may not feel confident in refusing the rogue traders. In a case last year in Newton Moor, in my constituency, reported in the Strathspey and Badenoch Herald, an elderly couple agreed to have their drive tarred for £600. Excuse me. For £600. The two men poured an oily liquid on the drive and brushed it in. Then they told the couple they had run out of material and needed £300 to buy more from their boss, who was allegedly running roadworks on the A9 and would supply them with his leftovers. The money was handed over, and of course they disappeared. Fortunately, and very unusually, suspects were traced, and the two men returned and handed back the money, but the drive was ruined. As well as the evidence from Citizens Advice Scotland on the number of people dissatisfied with jobs completed as a result of cold calling, there is also a worrying amount of anecdotal evidence which highlights some appalling practices. A worrying number of cases describe situations where the final bill is far larger than the price agreed before the work is started. Most troubling of all, there are all too many descriptions of customers being intimidated into paying, and even extreme examples of customers being marched to their closest cash line or bank and handing over large sums of cash to rogue traders. Practices such as these do not just adversely affect consumers, but they are also damaging to the vast majority of businesses who are honest and conduct their affairs properly. Without official records and operating through cash payments, rogue traders avoid tax and VAT liabilities and undermine the local economy. Trading Standards have been running an excellent campaign to encourage people confronted by cold callers not to be pressured into agreeing to work on the spot. They've created a No to Cold Calling poster for their website, which has been downloaded over 15,000 times. But unfortunately, these measures will not put off the worst offenders. In order to protect consumers and honest businesses, we must ensure that the police and Trading Standards have the tools to tackle this issue of cold calling for property maintenance and repairs. And I believe that the best way to achieve this is by bringing in legislation to outlaw the practice on the grounds of community safety. This would make it a criminal offence for people to cold call to do property maintenance and repairs at your door. And by making cold calling for property maintenance repairs illegal, rogue traders would be deterred from the practice, while the public would have increased confidence and a solid reason for refusing when a rogue trader turns up. The police and Trading Standards would have a far stronger hand to play when tackling such incidents, and would be able to greatly reduce the number of people who end up as victims of the poor service, extortion and scams that go hand in hand with this practice. However, I would also like to sound a note of caution. Last week, the Accounts Commission published its report, Protecting Consumers, which highlighted just how stretched Scottish Trading Standards services are. The report highlights that Trading Standards budgets have been cut disproportionately compared with other council departments. The number of officers is at a record low, and they are poorly coordinated. The benefit of legislation such as I am suggesting relies on the effectiveness of enforcement, and we must ensure that we take the Accounts Commission's recommendations on Trading Standards seriously, so that we can safeguard consumers and honest businesses alike. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I hope for a positive response from the Minister on the introduction of legislation to curb cold calling for property maintenance and repairs, and for an assurance that the Government will look seriously at the Account Commission's report, which calls for a redesign of the Trading Standards Service in Scotland. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Fiona MacLeod to be followed by Helen Eadie. 4-minute speeches, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking Dave Thompson for bringing this incredibly important topic to Parliament to be debated. And I also want to follow on from something that Dave Thompson said in his opening remarks about how the elderly are often the target for these ruthless criminals, basically. The Chamber knows that my constituency, Strathkelvin and Bearsden, encompasses one of the highest rising elderly populations in the whole of Scotland. And at the moment, 22% of the population are aged 60 years and over. And I thought it was interesting to follow on from what Dave Thompson was saying and to have a wee bit of a read at some of the stuff that folk are saying about older folk and their vulnerability. Help the Aged in 2006 found that older people were 3 times more likely to become the victims of property rather than personal crime. And we all worry about the old lady being mugged and her handbag stolen, but it's actually about property crime and cold calling. The Alzheimer's Society found that 15% of people with dementia had fallen victim to cold calling, scam mail and mis-selling. And in November 2009, in my own constituency, it was reported on a day when they did a census that police were receiving daily calls throughout the month of 2009. And in one case, it was a call from an old person who had already lost £10,000 to these cold callers, and it was only with the intervention of the police that this didn't reach the sum of £17,000. So in East Dunbartonshire, we're taking this very seriously. And through East Dunbartonshire Council's Trading Standards officers, who Dave Thompson has extolled the virtue of, and I will do that for my own in my council area, the East Dunbartonshire Trading Standards have decided to trial an item called True Call, This is a call blocking system that you can add on to your telephone, and it means that only people that you want to receive calls from do you answer the call to. Quite an expensive piece of equipment, but the trading standards have got some in so that older, more vulnerable people throughout my constituency can get them from trading standards and give them a try and see if that will help to keep them safer in their own homes. In March next month in Bishopbriggs, the Adult Protection Committee are going to hold a whole-day conference on financial safeguarding. I think that tells you how serious this is taken. And trading standards have gone into a year-long partnership with the police across my constituency, stopping and checking traders to find out that they are legitimate traders, but also using intelligence-led policing to actually patrol past vulnerable households where they know that perhaps the old folk have been. I'm terribly sorry, I'm not sure of the time I have left.
1 minute.
Thank you very much. I'll very quickly finish by saying this isn't just about money, and it's just not just about the attack on property. When this happens to older, vulnerable people, they lose their confidence and often lose their sense of independence, and it's something that we have to take seriously. In fact, in my constituency last year, we had a dreadful incident reported in the local papers of an elderly lady in her 70s persuaded into a car. When the police stopped, the chap took off with the elderly lady in the car, abandoned the car with the elderly lady in it, had 8 police cars, helicopters, dog units after him, and this old lady was left in the back of a car, terrified, upset, and all because this man thought he could get her to an ATM and get money out of her. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now call on Helen Needy to be followed by David Torrance.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I too congratulate Dave Thompson on securing this members' business debate, and as Fiona MacLeod rightly says, it is an incredibly important issue, and I warmly welcome the campaign by the Scottish branch of the Trading Standards Institute and the drive to see legislation put in place. I note from Dave Thompson's motion that he is supporting the Trading Institute in its call for legislation, and that he is hoping that the Scottish Government will meet the Trading Standards Institute to help with that campaign. I would like to add my voice to the motion and urge that it be given 100% support from all of us. The debate today brought back the memory of my parents when they were alive. Their experience was not dissimilar to experiences by some of my constituents, as I was to learn later once I became an MSP. Both were frail and elderly. My father was bedridden and in our living room. My mother answered the door, and there were 2 men on the doorstep who offered some work at the back of the house. One took my mum to the back door to show her what they proposed, and the other stayed with my dad in their living room. Mum's handbag was next to her armchair. The other guy leaned over to my mum's bag and lifted over £1,000 from the bag. My dad was powerless to stop what happened. The other man was not long, and it was only a few minutes before they were gone, but it was too late. The money was gone, and they left their victims, who, once they realised what had happened, were very distressed. Like so many old people, my parents had been saving for their funerals, and this money was in my mother's purse. They took the purse, but the crooks didn't know there was another £1,000 in a polythene bag in the same handbag. Typically, like so many elderly people, they liked to have cash in hand, and although they had a bank account, they wanted to have that cash in hand too. We later learned from the police that there had been a number of victims that same day, and all in the same vicinity of Stenhousemuir and Falkirk, where I was brought up, and my parents and their family home. I believe that the work of the Trading Standards Institute, the Office of Fair Trading, Citizens Advice Scotland and the police too are all invaluable. I have to congratulate the various TV producers whose work is first class in their programmes like Watchdog, Don't Get Done, Get Dom, Cowboy Trap, Rip Off Britain, to mention just a few. These are very powerful programmes, and apart from highlighting the dreadful cases that they do, they frequently help to put wrongs right, and more importantly, taking the public step by step what they have done, they illustrate how others can follow by example to put things right. All of those involved in the production of those programmes deserve special commendation. Anyone involved in protecting consumers deserve the highest praise, since victims are left distressed and powerless to know what to do next. Thankfully, we have so many silver surfers today, and I'm one of them. And it is great when I hear about 90-plus-year-olds going to classes to learn how to do their shopping online and to help them keep in touch with friends and family through social networking sites and to learn their rights. And no doubt some of them might watch this debate today. But above all, the important message to get out there into the public domain is to simply say to everyone across the country, don't trade with anyone that you don't know and don't have references for. Research on behalf of the Office of Fair Trading has shown that a fifth of people over 70 aren't confident in deciding whether to employ a doorstep salesperson, and 1 in 5 agreed with a range of statements which suggested that they might be vulnerable to rogue doorstep salespeople. Only deal with financial firms authorised by the Financial Services Authority. You can check if a firm is authorised by calling the FSA's register. And I just simply agree with Dave's last point, which was about the cuts in local government budgets. One of the cuts that we had to endure in Fife Council was the cuts to the money advice programme, and that was run by the Trading Standards people, and I thought a superb service, and I just wish you well in your endeavours, and if I can help in any way with you or the Trading Standards people, I will be right behind you. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call on David Torrance to be followed by Alex Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd also like to thank Dave Thompson for bringing this debate to prohibit cold calling for property maintenance and repairs to Parliament and highlight the problems associated with cold calling. Like many MSPs in this chamber today, every one of us has at some point most likely had to deal with complaints from constituents about cold calling and the distress it has caused, especially to elderly people. The Trading Standards Institute campaign is backed by Citizen Advice Scotland, Neighbourhood Watch and many others to help prohibit cold calling for property maintenance and repairs. This campaign has to be welcomed, as too often it is the most vulnerable in society that become the victims. Cold calling for property maintenance and repairs has seen an increase in doorstep crime incidents reported to police and Trading Standards over the past few years. The people who initiate doorstep calling, namely bogus workmen, high-pressure salespeople and fake officials, often target older people and those living alone. A consequence of this is often burglary, when distraction techniques are deliberately employed to enable theft to take place. On several occasions, victims have lost their life savings and, through embarrassment, are often fearful of telling relatives or friends. The subsequent financial implications frequently result in them living in hardship for many years. The vast majority of rogue traders identified as traders with no local connections and no fixed premises within the area, making it extremely difficult to track down. The recent survey by Trading Standards Institute involving feedback from 9,000 households holders showed that 96% of households did not want doorstep callers. These figures surely show that the public would overwhelmingly back any legislation to prohibit cold calling for purposes of property maintenance and repairs. There have been several local campaigns by Trading Standards, such as the one in Aberdeenshire entitled Cold Calling, Don't Buy It, or by Fife Council, which operates a trusted trader scheme. The most successful, however, has to be a cold calling control zones, initiated by Cardiff Council. This scheme was supported by police community officers and Trading Standards teams. Since its inception in the Heath and Canton areas of Cardiff in the spring of 2008, 83% of residents believed that the number of cold callers had decreased, 80% believed they were safer in the zone, and 90% found they were more confident in being able to turn cold callers away. The police also reported a significant reduction in crimes of all types in cold calling control zones such as burglaries, theft from motor vehicles and all other types of theft. The cold calling control zones were so successful that they have now been rolled out to another 11 locations across the city. It is also encouraging to see that Highland Council are now in the process of setting up a cold calling control zone in Inverness, and is also trying to establish further zones across Highlands in conjunction with various partners. In closing, Presiding Officer, there is a substantial amount of evidence which illustrates that prohibiting cold calling can have a significant impact on the community. It reduces crime, thus reducing the misery inflicted on the most vulnerable sectors of society. And I hope that the Scottish Government will take up the opportunity to discuss Trading Standards Institute Scotland's campaign to prohibit cold calling.
Many thanks. Now call on Alex Johnson to be followed by Nigel Dunn.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by congratulating Dave Thompson on bringing this issue to the Scottish Parliament for debate? And can I also offer the apologies of Mary Scanlon, for whom I am a last-minute replacement. Mary is a signatory to the motion and intended to participate in this debate, and I hope I can do justice to what she intended to say. There is, in fact, an obvious issue in relation to cold calling in relation to property repairs. And as we've heard in this debate already, and I'm sure all members have heard from people who have suffered as a result of it, it does provide an extraordinarily effective opportunity for illegal activity. And this debate will simply highlight that once again. It is something which I am fully supportive of appropriate regulation of, in order to prevent the kind of attacks that have happened, particularly on the weak, the vulnerable and the elderly. And I would not wish to see that continue. In fact, it surprises me that there are two groups here. There are also another group out there who are so set against participating in the doorstep trade that they will not believe anyone who comes to their door. And anyone who has been involved, for example, or been approached in relation to the installation of home energy efficiency measures, some of which claim to be supported by the government, are quite often resistant to that simply because it's a cold caller, and some of it may be quite legitimate for all I know. But there's one issue which I wanted to raise here, and it's one which is very sensitive, and it's one which I will raise very carefully so that I am not misunderstood. And that is something which I've been aware of for a while, and which I learned more about only yesterday, when I, along with members of the Equal Opportunities Committee, visited a traveller's site at Clintertane near Aberdeen, where we had an opportunity to interact with a number of agencies, including travellers themselves, and we had a full meeting of the committee in the afternoon. Now, as many of you will know, there are quite a number of people within the travelling community for whom the business model they use is effectively cold calling, quite often offering property repairs or landscaping or gardening services. Now, I'm not suggesting that these people are the problem in themselves. What I'm suggesting is that they may well, for all we know, be legitimate, and that for the traveller community, this is the only available business model for which they can operate at the moment. Now, while I am fully supportive of the kind of method or the kind of proposals that Dave Thompson has brought forward, I am concerned that by simply outlawing cold calling for property repairs and similar services, that we may drive legitimate travelling people using that business model to a point where they may no longer be legitimate traders. And that's why, if we go down this road, with my support, I would like to ensure that we do apply some thought to how legitimate members of the travelling community may be allowed to continue their business in some form. That is, to find a way that they can continue their business without using the cold calling method. I'm afraid I haven't had the time or the opportunity to come up with a formal proposal on that, but I would not wish to see these members of our community marginalised simply because their business method has quite rightly been made illegal. So, with that said, Mr. Presiding Officer, I would like to redouble my support for the principles that lie behind this motion and ask that we can work together to find a way through that particular problem.
Many thanks. I now call on Nigel Donn to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too thank Dave Thompson for bringing this incredibly important debate to us. And I also thank Alex Johnson for his contribution, firstly because I think he articulated very clearly that cold calling to do with the property is one of those very good opportunities for the crook to get their foot quite literally in the door or round the back. And it's essentially that they get into the house and into the confidence of an uncertain and possibly vulnerable mind that then gives them the opportunity to carry on doing what they're doing. I also have to support Alex Johnson's comments about travellers with whom I've been involved in the past. I think he's very eloquently made the point about their own model and the possibly unintended consequences of what's being suggested. It may very well be that they will have to change their model a bit, but I thank you for bringing that to us. Can I remind colleagues that we are dealing with rogues? There's absolutely no value in this in talking about ways of proper training and methods of operation, and people should study this and stick to this or that or the other protocol. It's just not going to happen. It's got absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about. And the moment we talk about victims of cold calling, then I think it's important that we reflect on the behaviour that enables somebody to be vulnerable. It's partly their age, undoubtedly, and of course if you stick around, you get to being older. We're all working on it. It's an instinct. It's partly, of course, ignorance, and actually, I don't mean that unkindly, because there are many things which we are all ignorant of, and by and large, whether the tiles on the roof need fettled is one of those things that most of us are not very good at judging, and I have a suspicion that by the time I'm 80, whilst I might be capable of judging it, it'll actually be quite difficult even to look. So these are the kind of areas where simply by dint of our circumstances, we are very vulnerable to somebody else coming along and telling us what they think, and it's extraordinarily difficult to tell them they are wrong. I also do think saying scams are maybe part of this whole issue, though they're not specifically in the motion, that we need to reflect that as human beings we're actually very good at thinking we're going to get something for nothing. There's that instinctive greed that thinks if somebody tells me I have got an insurance claim or I've won something, it's just awfully easy to believe them, isn't it? And then, coming back to the victim, once we have fallen for it, what are our immediate reactions? Well, embarrassment, yes. And do we really want to tell people? Well, broadly, no. And then, of course, we're back to the ignorance. Well, what do I do when somebody's actually done this to me? Is the law effective? We don't expect it to be. Do I really want to tell the police? Do I want to tell my family? And, of course, we've already heard about the distinct lack of confidence, loss of confidence in older folk. Can I say this has been around for a long time? I am assured that the Eiffel Tower has been sold for scrap. Of course, it was going to be a secret deal and you were going to get a wonderful bargain, my boy, but the French government couldn't possibly make this an open tender. So, would you pay up for this and you'll take it down at your leisure? So effective was it the first time, it actually happened twice. Yeah, that's what we do, isn't it? Time is running away, as it always does. The law is clearly not as effective as it needs to be. But we do have to recognise that if we hang around long enough, we are most of us going to become vulnerable. The law is clearly not as effective as it might be. We need to protect the vulnerable within our society. No, it's not going to be easy, but whoever said it was going to be easy, we really must deal with it. And I thank again Dave Thompson for bringing this to the attention of Parliament.
Many thanks. Now calling Ken McIntosh to be followed by Graham Day.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. And can I also start by thanking Dave Thompson for bringing forward his motion and for giving the Parliament an opportunity to discuss this important issue today. I'd also like to thank Paul Holland, who's a trading standards officer in my own area of East Renfrewshire, for first alerting me to the extent and the serious nature of this issue, and also to Brian Smith and Brian Wilson from the Trading Standards Institute of Scotland, who have helped turn this into a national campaign. And if we look at how serious an issue this is, it certainly is true that scams in general are on the increase. It's difficult to put a financial value on them. The Office of Fair Trading, I note, made an estimate as far back as 2005, suggesting that mass market scams, that's telephone and mail scams, are costing the economy about £1 billion, or consumers about £1 billion each year. Now, cold calling is a doorstep crime. It's not really at that same financial level, but it's far more serious psychologically. And as several members have also commented, there's a problem with the underreporting of figures for many reasons, including the embarrassment and humiliation of the individuals themselves being left to look foolish, to be made to seem foolish. And in some cases, residents are frightened. And if you look at who's targeted, it's not surprised that that's their reaction. The typical vulnerable resident might be, for example, an 84-year-old woman living alone and living at home by herself without the support of family or friends. And traders quickly established that personal situation very early on and prey on that vulnerability. Residents have stated that they feel coerced into agreeing to work, which is often not what they've requested or completely unnecessary. The trader persists in using excuses to attend at the resident's home to extort more cash. And this type of persistence can leave consumers feeling confused, distressed, and results in them agreeing to almost anything in the hope that they will be left alone. Workmanship, if anything is carried out, is often shoddy, and more often than not, the original problems are left not being repaired satisfactorily, resulting in the consumer having to contact the trader time and time again. The trader then becomes aggressive and abusive towards the consumer and refuses to rectify the problem. And it gets more serious. Sometimes the trader insists on cash payments and will, as other members have contributed, will often accompany the resident to the bank, ensuring that the cash is paid and how and when the trader demands it's paid. And this can be a very frightening ordeal for anyone taken in a vehicle with people that they don't really know. And the impact on the consumer is devastating. In many instances, they're left feeling mentally and physically unwell with little or no support. Now, having all of us agreed on the extent of the problem, I think the important point is that we recognise that there are so many things we can do about it. Just to give you an example from East Renfrewshire, in East Renfrewshire, very simple methods, 20,000 no-cold calling stickers were issued and 6,000 no-cold calling leaflets. This is just simply giving information to residents, but also giving them the confidence to be able to say no to these callers. More interesting steps they took, they provided training materials to banks in the area, and this was in the form of a training video called The Bank Job on spotting suspicious withdrawals. And they also are working to put in place formal support procedures to identify vulnerable residents with dementia, and I think there's a particular group that we need to target. Even more proactive, they worked with the police to target the tradesmen themselves. So they used the law, the cancellation of contracts rights and so on, and they identified hotspots. They tried to check on benefit fraud. They identified whether vehicles were suitably insured, taxed and roadworthy. So in other words, they took a number of steps to clamp down on the traders themselves. And I think we agreed that the abuse of vulnerable residents by cold callers currently can be treated either as fraud or as a consumer protection issue, or, as the Trading Standards Institute have highlighted, as a community safety issue. The point is we can and must do more if we're to tackle this crime. I congratulate Dave Thompson once more on bringing this forward, and I look forward to the Minister's reply on behalf of the Government.
Thank you very much. I now call on Graham Day, after which we'll move to the Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Whatever the extent of under-reporting, the number of serious doorstep crime incidents linked to cold calling, which are drawn to the attention both of the police and the Trading Standards Services, has grown significantly over the past few years. And certainly all too often it is the most vulnerable, particularly elderly members of our society, that are targeted by rogue cold callers, with incidents involving older people losing thousands and thousands of pounds emerging with worrying frequency. Unfortunately, the response and the support of enforcement agencies has not kept pace with the skills, organisation and indeed shamelessness of the criminals involved, or indeed the changing nature of cold calling related misbehaviour. And this is something we surely have to look at addressing. Despite various education and awareness programmes being established by Trading Standards, there remains a lack of grasp of the dangers cold callers can bring. In a National Trading Standards Institute survey, only 13% of people reported asking for IDs from cold callers, and only 1.3% actually checked these out. Similarly, the use of door chains was disappointingly low, with only 39% of households having one fitted, and only 6% ever actually using them. These statistics, Presiding Officer, surely make clear that a great deal more needs to be done. An outright prohibition of cold calling for property maintenance, upgrading or repair has, as the TSI believes, surely become something worthy of consideration, as despite these campaigns, some of our most vulnerable fellow Scots continue to be open to the risk of falling victim to unscrupulous or outright criminal traders. In many instances, people are worn down by repeated and sustained targeting over a long period of time. One example provided by Trading Standards officers from my own area concerned a man in his 80s, widowed and living alone. He was visited by itinerant traders over a 2-month period in late 2011. They were seeking to persuade him to have the communal track to his property resurfaced, an action which, of course, would have required the agreement of a financial contribution from all parties with an interest in the track. After a brief respite over Christmas, the visits and the pressurising recommenced until eventually, having been offered a discount rate of £1,640, down from £2,600, he gave in. Some 6 weeks after the commissioned work was carried out, the trader's son convinced the gentleman he needed to spend another £650 to further repair the surface. For a grand total of £2,290, all that was done was the filling in of a few potholes and a degree of general improvement work, which was independently assessed as being insufficient to last beyond the very short term. A different, more general example of scandalous exploitation of the vulnerable from my part of the country involves a very elderly consumer who had been persuaded to sign up to £10,000 worth of solar panels, paying a £1,000 deposit following a cold call. When his carer realised what he'd done, they contacted the company seeking to get him out of the contract. Initially, the firm concerned agreed to this, before then claiming he'd been in breach of contract. Trading standards were called in, and officers immediately realised the gentleman had problems with his memory. In fact, they determined he was suffering from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and they pursued the company, pointing out he actually did not have the capacity to enter into such an agreement. Eventually, the deposit was refunded and the contract cancelled. But, Presiding Officer, what would have happened if Trading Standards hadn't become involved in this case? Now, this example may not sit entirely within the parameters Dave Thompson envisages, but I highlight it because it surely raises the question, if the regulated market is prepared to exploit the clearly vulnerable in this way, what restraint can we expect the rogues to show? Of course, prosecution in cases of willful exploitation of these people is extremely difficult. The unscrupulous choose their victims carefully. They target those who are incapable of being convincing witnesses in any court, if, of course, these individuals are caught and it goes to court. That's why, in the instances highlighted in the motion, we need to offer additional consumer protection which goes beyond the established or conventional, which may well need to take the form of prohibiting cold calling. Presiding Officer, can I congratulate my colleague Dave Thompson for bringing forward this motion and also offer my support not only to it but to the work of Trading Standards the length and breadth of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Minister Rosanna Cunningham to close this debate on behalf of the Government.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I too congratulate Dave Thompson on securing this debate. I know, of course, that he has a long-standing professional interest in trading standards issues and probably the right person to raise such an issue on the floor of this chamber. The debate is actually very apposite, given that we have just been debating human rights in general during the afternoon. Now we are discussing an individual right, and that's the right to live our lives free from crime and the fear of crime. And I do believe everyone has the right to feel safe in their community, and that it is unacceptable for people to feel intimidated in their own homes. Our aim is to make Scotland a safer and stronger place and an inclusive and respectful society. Now, the UK Government's plans to restructure the consumer landscape are currently being implemented. Of course, I believe the interest of Scottish consumers would be best served if relevant consumer-focused powers were devolved to this Parliament. You would expect to hear me say that. Consumer protection is already devolved in Northern Ireland, but a request to do a similar thing in Scotland has been, in my view, inexplicably declined. So we have to focus on ensuring that the UK Government's policies deliver for consumers in Scotland. And the role of trading standards in local authorities is crucial in helping safeguard the health, safety and environment of its citizens. Trading standards have an established history of protecting citizens and ensuring a fair market for business to flourish. And I would like to take this opportunity to join with other members this evening in thanking them for the contribution they are making to combating rogue traders. And I also want to welcome all of the good work done by local authorities, the police service and trading standards that already goes on right across Scotland to tackle the issue of cold calling. In doing so, it is important to acknowledge that cold calling can be part of serious and organised crime networks. And although that aspect of the issue has not been debated in the members' debate tonight, but it is an aspect that does have to be taken on board. And I welcome the recent report from Audit Scotland entitled Protecting Consumers, and in doing so recognise both the work COSLA and councils are currently doing to improve national coordination, but also the scope for better integration between councils, which I think is a very important aspect of the intelligence gathering and sharing that is probably required for tackling this. Members have talked about specific issues in their own area, and of course the groups of people who are carrying out these scams will not be confining themselves just to one area. They will be moving from area to area, and therefore the intelligence sharing is extremely important. Fiona MacLeod, David Torrance, Helen Eadie, Ken McIntosh and Graham Day are all right to raise the issue of the differential impact of this behaviour on older people. And of course that's a function of the fact that older people tend to be in far more often during the day. They are sitting ducks, sitting targets for this. The stories they have all related are harrowing. I was interested to hear of the local trial in Fiona MacLeod's constituency. Recently I met with the Scottish Pensioners Forum. That was in November last year, and I'm only too aware of the very real physical and mental impact that cold calling can have on often elderly and vulnerable individuals, which in turn increases the fear of crime for individuals and communities. But Alec Johnson actually did raise a particularly sensitive issue, and I think he should be commended for coming to this debate to make the points he made. Because what he's done is remind us that not all cold callers are necessarily bogus. Some may be acting on government initiatives. Others rely on cold calling as a business model. And that means dealing with this is something which would have to be very carefully thought through so as to avoid the law of unintended consequences, something Nigel Dawn reminded us of in his remarks. And indeed, as members such as David Torrance and Ken McIntosh relate, there are already many initiatives in place across Scotland to tackle cold calling. Perhaps they need to be joined up more, and that's an aspect I mentioned earlier. But for example, last year Lothian and Borders Police launched a new initiative focused on doorstep crime, which aimed to decrease the number of bogus callers, rogue trader workmen targeting the communities of West Lothian. And this initiative fostered an increased feeling of empowerment within the community to challenge these individuals and reduce the chance of becoming a victim. My colleague Kenny McCaskill saw this initiative for himself in March last year and was impressed by its impact. Indeed, to date, we have provided funding of over £400,000 to Neighbourhood Watch Scotland to support its work. It played an important role in offering reassurance to local communities by sharing alerts on potential criminal activities in their area, offering advice on keeping safe and encouraging communities to look out for one another, especially the elderly and vulnerable. The initiatives the Scottish Business Crime Centre promotes are also crucial. Their Adults at Risk of Financial Harm conference in 2012 brought together a number of delegates from Scottish Government, local authorities, the business community, law enforcement, fire and rescue services and the voluntary sector. All parties agreed on a strategic commitment to collaborate consistently and effectively with a common objective, the protection of vulnerable adults who may be subjected to financial abuse by others. Now, the issue of cold calling was specifically addressed at this event in presentations by Scottish Scam Busters, Lothian and Borders Police and Angus Council. Graham Day might be interested to hear that. The SBCC is also working closely with a range of partners to deliver a scam-free Scotland, with a joint awareness campaign being launched just in the spring 2013, and I would commend members to look out for that. My officials are already working with SBCC to provide a central intelligence hub, which will go some way to addressing the lack of national data on this issue. So I'd like to thank Dave Thompson for putting forward this motion and to other members for their valuable contributions. And I do commend members to some of the existing schemes, the upcoming campaign and the work that is currently being done and looked at in respect of this particular issue. Thank you.
Many thanks. And that concludes today's business, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.